The Bell Witch of Tennessee. There is perhaps no haunting in America that resonates quite like the event that occurred on the farm of John Bell in rural Tennessee. This story stands unique in all of folklore as one of the most rare cases in which a spirit not only injured the residents of a haunted house, but also caused the death of one of them. For this reason, even though the haunting occurred in the early 1800s, it is yet to be forgotten. The story of the Bell Witch will be forever linked to the small town of Adams in northwestern Tennessee. In 1804, John Bell, his wife, Lucy, and their 6 children came to the region from North Carolina. He purchased 1,000 acres of land on the Red River, and the Bell family settled quite comfortably into the community. John Bell was well liked, and kind words were always expressed about Lucy, who often opened her home to travelers and hosted social gatherings. The Bell haunting began in 1817 after John Bell and his son, Drew, spotted odd creatures in the woods near their farm. When they shot at the strange beasts, they vanished. Soon after, a series of weird knocking, scraping, and scratching sounds began on the exterior of the house and then at the front door. Shortly thereafter, the sounds moved inside and seemed to emanate from the bedroom belonging to the Bell sons. This continued for weeks, and before long, the irritating sounds were heard all over the house. They continued from room to room, stopping when everyone was awake and starting again when they all went back to bed. The Bells also heard what sounded like dogs pawing at the wooden door or chains being dragged through the house. They even heard thumps and thuds as though furniture was being overturned. These sounds were frightening, but not as terrifying as the noises that followed. The smacking of lips, gurgling, gulping, and choking. Sounds seemingly made by a human. The nerves of the Bell family were starting to unravel as the sounds became a nightly occurrence. The disembodied sounds were followed by unseen hands. Items in the house were broken, blankets were yanked from beds, hair was pulled, and the children were slapped and poked, causing them to cry in pain. The Bell's daughter Betsy was once slapped so hard that her cheeks stayed bright red for hours. Whatever the cause of this unseen force, most of its violent outbursts were directed at Betsy. She would often run screaming from her room in terror as the unseen hands prodded, pinched, and poked her. Strangely, the force became even crueler to her whenever she entertained her young suitor, Joshua Gardner, at the house. Desperately seeking answers, John Bell enlisted the help of some of his neighbors to investigate. Even in the presence of these witnesses, the strange sounds continued. Chairs overturned and objects flew about the room. The neighbors formed an investigative committee, determined to find a cause for the terrifying events. Regardless, the household was in chaos. Words began to spread of the strange happenings, and friends and strangers came to the farm to witness it for themselves. Dozens of people heard the banging and rapping sounds, and chunks of rock and wood were thrown at curious guests by unseen hands. As the investigative committee searched for answers, they set up experiments, tried to communicate with the force, and kept a close eye on the events that took place. They set up overnight vigils, but the attacks only increased in intensity. Betsy was treated brutally and began to have sensations that the breath was being sucked out of her body. She was scratched and her flesh bled as though she was being pierced with invisible pins and needles. She also suffered fainting spells and often blacked out for 30 to 40 minutes at a time. Soon a raspy whistling sound was audible, as if someone was trying to speak. It progressed until the force began to talk in a weak whisper. The voice told them it was a spirit whose rest had been disturbed, and it had made many claims to its origins, from being an ancient spirit to the ghost of a murdered peddler. The excitement in the community grew as word spread that the spirit was communicating. People came from far and wide to hear the unexplained voice. Hundreds of people witnessed the activity caused by the witch. There were those who came to the Bell farm intent on either driving out the witch or proving that the entire affair was a hoax. But without fail, each of them left the farm confessing that the unusual events were beyond their understanding. John Bell began to complain of a curious numbness in his mouth that caused his tongue to swell so greatly that he was unable to eat or drink for days at a time. As the hauntings progressed, he began to suffer other inexplainable symptoms, most notably bizarre facial tics that rendered him unable to talk or eat and often made him lose consciousness. These odd seizures lasted from a few hours to a week, and they increased in severity as time wore on. No one knows why John Bell was targeted by the spirit, but from the beginning, the witch made it clear that it would be tormenting him for the rest of his life. Bell was also physically abused by the witch, and many witnesses recalled him being slapped by unseen hands or crying out in pain as he was stabbed with invisible pins. Bell's doctor was helpless when it came to finding a cure for his ailments. The witch laughed at his efforts and declared that no medicine could cure him. Some believe the reason for Bell's suffering was revealed one night when the spirit claimed to belong to Kate Batts, an eccentric neighbor who had disliked Bell because of some bad business dealings in the past. Whether the spirit was Batts is unknown, but people began calling the witch Kate. By 1820, John Bell's physical condition had worsened. His facial jerks and twitches continued, as did the swelling of his tongue and the seizures that left him nearly paralyzed for hours or even days at a time. In late October, he suffered another fit, and it took him to bed. He would never leave the house again. Kate remained nearby, laughing and cursing at the dying man. On the morning of December 19, 1820, Lucy checked on her husband, who appeared to be sleeping soundly. An hour later, she returned to the bedroom and realized that he was in a stupor. When John Jr. went to get his father's medicine, he discovered that all of his father's prescriptions had vanished. In place of them was a small vial that contained a dark-colored liquid. No one knew what had happened to the medicines or what was in the vial. Suddenly, Kate's voice took over the room. She claimed that she had poisoned Bell with the contents of the dark vial and that he would never rise from his bed again. The mysterious liquid was tested on a family cat, and the animal was dead in seconds. John Bell never did recover. On December 20th, he took his last shuddering breath and died. Laughter filled the house as the witch stated that she hoped John Bell would burn in hell. Bell was laid to rest in a small cemetery a short distance from the family home. As the mourners left the cemetery, the voice of Kate returned, echoing loudly in the cold morning air. She cheered the death of the man she hated so much. This ended the most terrifying chapter of a haunting that left an indelible mark in the supernatural history of all time. But the Bell Witch was not finished, at least not quite yet. After the funeral, the activities of the witch seemed to subside, but she was not totally gone. Kate remained with the family throughout the winter and spring of 1821, but she was not quite as vicious as she had been, not even to Betsy, around whom her activities continued to be centered. During the haunting, it was clear that Betsy would be punished as long as she allowed herself to be courted by Joshua Gardner. But Betsy and Joshua refused to give in to Kate's wishes. In fact, on Easter Sunday, 1821, the couple became engaged, much to the delight of their family and friends. But their joy would not last long, as the antics of the witch returned with a horrific force. Realizing that the witch would never leave her alone as long as she stayed with Joshua, Betsy broke off the engagement and never saw him again. In the summer of 1821, the witch left the Bell family, promising to return in 7 years. In 1828, she came back and announced her return in the same manner as when the original haunting first began. Scratching and other eerie sounds inside and outside the house, objects moving, blankets pulled from the beds. The Bells decided to ignore the activity, and if spoken to by the spirit, they ignored it as well. In this way, they hoped the visitation might end quickly. And so it did. The witch left the house after a few weeks. However, much of the activity during the witch's 1828 visit took place at the home of John Bell Jr., who had built a house on the land that he had inherited from his father. The witch allegedly made several accurate predictions about the future, including the Civil War, the end of slavery, the rise of the United States as a world power, and the coming of World Wars I and II. She even predicted the end of the world, stating that the world would end with the temperature of the planet rising so high that it would become uninhabitable. Kate stayed with John Bell Jr. for several months. Before she left, she promised to return again in 107 years, which would be 1935. And though there is no record that she ever did so, and there are some that maintain that the Bell Witch was never left Adams, Tennessee, strange events still occur where the old Bell farm stood. Old Kate is still talked about today, and you'd have to travel pretty far to find someone who does not believe that something very strange occurred there in the early 1800s. What was it exactly? No one knows for sure, but there's no question that it made a huge mark on American supernatural history.